Our speaker today is the editor-in-chief in the Daily Wire. We all love him, obviously, from the Ben Shapiro Show, the top conservative podcast in the nation. He was 17 when he became a syndicated, show host, the youngest in America's history. He's the author of 7 books. Several of them have ended up on the New York Times bestseller list. Honestly, he earned his BA in political science at UCLA, graduated from Harvard Law, all right? And what I appreciate about him is that we might not share the same faith. I mean, he's a devout Jewish friend, and we are Christians. But this morning, we talked so much about what we have in common, and so much about our desire to see the sanctity of life be protected in the life of a baby in a womb. We talked a lot about our beliefs. I know you're excited. I'm gonna get out of the way. Come on, let's put our hands together for the one, the only, Ben Shapiro, everybody.
Well, thank you so much. It really is a pleasure and an honor to be here today at Liberty University. I'd like to give a special thanks to Fred Allen and Young America's Foundation for making this event possible. Obviously, sponsoring these sorts of events makes it possible for me to bring good news and good words to, I think, a lot of folks around the country. Here, I think they need it less than maybe some of the other places that I speak. Before I begin, I wanted to take just a moment so we can silently pray together for Alfie Evans. If you don't know the story of Alfie Evans is a 2-year-old child in Britain who has a degenerative brain condition, and the government of Britain is now declaring that his parents cannot leave the country with Alfie Evans to seek experimental treatment. He has to stay in a hospital and die at the hand of the state. So before we go any further, I'd like to just take about 5 seconds here, 10 seconds, and just pray silently for Alfie and his family, who are, I think, doing God's work and standing up for the value of life. Thank you, I appreciate it. Well, I've long believed that the future of our nation is inextricably intertwined with the future of Judeo-Christian value system. And I know of very few places in the United States that are more valuable to that future than right here at Liberty University. I'm just blown away by you guys. America was built on a fundamental idea, an idea that was the product of nearly 3,000 years of philosophical evolution. That idea, planted at Sinai, watered in the Galilee, pruned through the thought of Athens, and strengthened by the push and pull of reason and revelation for centuries, was embedded by our founders in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. And that principle is simple, that human beings are made in the image of God, that we are therefore beneficiaries of inalienable God-given rights, that government was created in order to protect those rights, not invade them, and that we must use our freedom to pursue virtue. God said to Pharaoh, "Let my people go so that they may worship me." Okay, the United States echoed that message from its very inception. George Washington stated in his first inaugural address, quote, "Since there exists in the economy and course of nature an indissoluble union between virtue and happiness, between duty and advantage, the propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained." The very basis of our politics, then, lies in the recognition that rights without virtues lead to chaos, and that virtues without rights lead to tyranny. Only by balancing public rights with private virtues can we truly uphold freedom and pursue happiness. One half of the equation, though, seems to have gone awry in modern America. We've been taught that our rights are paramount, which is fine, but we have also been taught that we have no duty to be virtuous. In fact, anyone who says that we have a duty to be virtuous is harming you, microaggressing you, ethnocentrically mansplaining to you in cisgender fashion. How can anyone expect us to be virtue, the argument goes, when the system itself is so deeply flawed? How can we blame people for being immoral when the system is biased in favor of a few white, rich men at the top? First, we have to fix the system. Then human beings themselves will change. Virtue will become natural. We'll all just magically become wonderful, great people. All we have to do to make this magical thing happen is hand over all our freedoms to a centralized government, and that government will then provide us new rights, better than the old God-given ones. Instead of the right to free speech, the government will provide us a right not to be offended. Our feelings will be protected. Instead of a right to life, the government will provide us the right to kill unborn babies. Instead of a right to create and keep the wages of our labor, the government will provide us a nice, comfortable social safety net without us actually having to do the work. Then, after all that's done, human beings will magically become better, will become good if all this happens. This is the philosophy of collectivism, the philosophy that says that human beings suffer because the Judeo-Christian system expects too much of us individually. Judeo-Christian philosophy expects us to struggle, to strive. Judeo-Christian philosophy demands that we do our best and that we act virtuously on the individual level so that we can feel secure without invading each other's rights. The Judeo-Christian tradition says that with freedom comes responsibility. Collectivist philosophy, however, thinks differently. They expect us to give our individual striving up. No more striving, no more struggle. All we have to do is trade our individual responsibility for the comfort of collective power. Collectivist philosophy points out that individual virtue isn't natural. It is a struggle. And we can avoid that struggle by handing over all power to a nanny state. Judeo-Christianity says you're free and therefore you must give. Collectivist philosophy says you are unfree and thus the state must take on your behalf. It's this philosophy of collectivism against which Moses and Jesus and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison fought. It is this philosophy that Americans have fought and bled and died to extend to more and more people over time. Abraham Lincoln saw black slaves as human beings, and hundreds of thousands of Americans died to extend the American covenant to them. American soldiers left their corpses on the beaches of Normandy to extend that promise to subject peoples. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated fighting to extend the American promise to black Americans. Ronald Reagan spent his years fighting to spread the light of Americanism beyond the Berlin Wall. And today, Americans liberate Muslims in the Middle East from the heavy hand of collectivist Islamism. Americans protect South Koreans and Taiwanese, free people, from the burden of North Korean and Chinese communism. Americans stand ready to thwart the threat of collectivist tyranny across the globe. But there is a threat to founding philosophy growing right here at home. It's growing because too many Americans believe that virtue is less important than virtue signaling. Okay, too many Americans believe that freedom is actually a burden. Too many Americans believe that they know what's best for other Americans, even when they personally abandon virtue. So, the question becomes, how exactly do we go about restoring the Judeo-Christian tradition upon which the nation was built? How exactly do we bring back the philosophy of the founders and restore their promise? Well, to do that, we have to go back to basics. We actually have to talk about morality in politics, not just efficiency, not just why our ideas work, but morality. What is good and what is bad, what is right, what is wrong, what is true and what is evil. Now, advocates for personal philosophy, for founding philosophy, these personal freedoms, individual responsibility, we make a pretty big mistake when we talk about that philosophy because we do spend a lot of time talking about how effective it is. We point out that free markets have led to the greatest reduction in poverty in world history. In 1981, 44.3% of the global population lived on less than $1.90 a day. In 2015, the global extreme poverty rate dipped below 10%. We, on the right, like to point out that a philosophy of individualism has led to massive increases in living standards within the United States and also around the world. And we point out that collectivist countries tend to stagnate. But we don't point too often to underlying values. See, here's the thing we have to acknowledge. There is a draw to collectivism. There is a draw to leftism. The draw is pretty simple. Collectivism promises solutions to cosmic injustices. When collectivists stand up here and invoke the least specific, I mean like here on this stage, and invoke the least specific verses of the Bible to justify government redistributionism and crackdowns on religious practice because of fairness, they are making a moral appeal. When Bernie Sanders stands up here and tells you that the top 1% of the 1% own 90% of all the wealth, when he says that America is not a just society, in line with a context-free verse from a book he's never read by Amos, and then suggests that if you give him more power, he will rectify that unfairness, that is a moral appeal. It is not an argument about efficiency. It's a bad moral appeal, of course. Inequality doesn't necessarily mean unfairness, but it is a moral appeal. And that moral appeal, unfortunately, for too many people is effective. It's effective because it goes to our hearts, not to our heads. It reminds us of fundamental values, even if it's skewing those fundamental values. Conservatives tend to talk about what works. People on the left tend to talk about what's fair. But values are not a left-wing monopoly. In fact, the fundamental values of Western civilization run a hell of a lot deeper than the shallow values of the collectivists. The values that resonate most with human beings are eternal, not changeable, and not relativistic. They are universal. They are not group-specific. And most of all, they apply to individual human beings, not group labels. And those values were first embedded clearly and concisely in the Ten Commandments. If we return to those values, we will be a virtuous citizenry deserving of our liberty. And if we turn away from those values, well, then we'll return to the horror of collectivism and tyranny.